In Hyde Park in London, across the street from the Royal Albert Hall, you'll find an impressive monument commemorating the life of Prince Albert, royal consort of Queen Victoria. How is the Albert Memorial representative of the Victorian period? How has its reception changed over time? How is it received today? Let's talk about it on today's Food for Thought. I'm going to be referring today to Simon Heffer's book, High Minds, the Victorians and the Birth of Modern Britain. And I'll quote a brief passage out of this book for you, and we'll talk a little bit about the Albert Memorial. So in his book, High Minds, Simon Heffer explores the intellectual, social, and political transformations in England between roughly 1840 and 1880. And within this narrative, the building of the Albert Memorial, it's featured right here on the cover, is presented as a monumental undertaking that encapsulates the Victorian cult of the great man, with Prince Albert as its central figure. Heffer dedicates a significant portion of the book, some might say too much so, to the great projects of the age, including the Albert Memorial and also the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace, the Royal Albert Hall, things like that. The Albert Memorial was more than just a monument. It was a physical manifestation of Victorian ideals and a testament to the outsized impact Prince Albert had on British society. Let me quote from the book here. This is from page 371. The memorial was opened in August 1872 after the Queen had inspected it for the first time the previous month. She found it really magnificent. However, there were still 3 more years to wait before the colossal statue itself would grace it. The elaborate friezes that had taken so long to sculpt were at least well received by the general public. In the finished statue, Albert is robed as a Knight of the Garter and holds a catalogue of the Great Exhibition. The statue then had to be gilded, at which point the job was finished. The edifice was 176 feet high on completion, topped by a large golden cross. It had taken more than a decade and had cost £120,000. The memorial, which Scott saw as his most prominent work, became the incarnation of high Victorian Gothic architecture and the centerpiece of the cult of death. The subjects of the friezes and allegorical sculptures and the determination to commemorate Albert for his commitment to art, science, and the dissemination of knowledge show the will of that age to be associated with improvement. Scott's design, and indeed the Queen's choice of him to execute it in that style, show the conviction that the Gothic was deemed to be the medium through which this commitment to high culture would be best expressed. In terms of the pursuit of perfection, it was at that moment, the mid-1860s, when it was conceived and commissioned, the ideal combination of form and subject. So it was a grand undertaking. The sheer scale, cost, and artistic ambition of the Albert Memorial is covered in great detail here. Its construction is reflected a collective desire to honor this figure who is seen as instrumental to the nation's progress. The architectural and sculptural elements symbolize Albert's support of art, science, industry, and the British Empire. The monument was also a symbol of national grief and idealization. Albert died suddenly, plunging Queen Victoria into deep mourning and the nation into a prolonged period of public grief. The Albert Memorial was a direct response to this, but it also literally put Albert on a pedestal, aiming to make him a quasi-heroic figure. Heffer frames these Victorian achievements as great projects. The Albert Memorial, the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace, the Royal Albert Hall. They're all tangible representations of Victorian progress, ambition, and the belief in human perfectibility. Influenced by Thomas Carlyle's philosophy that the history of the world is but the biography of great men, Heffer sees Prince Albert as an embodiment of this Victorian myth-making cult of the great man. And regardless of whether Albert actually fits the bill, we can study what the Victorians valued in a quote-unquote great man. So the great man is an intellectual and moral authority. Albert was seen as a polymath and a moral compass. He was deeply interested in science and education and art and social reform. And the memorial's design, with its allegorical figures representing various fields of human endeavor, reflect this perception of Albert as this universal genius, this universal guiding light for national improvement. And the great man is seen as a driving force behind progress. Albert's high-profile role in initiatives like the Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased Britain's industrial might and global reach. Albert was not merely a consort, but an active, intelligent force behind many of the era's advancements, and the memorial seems to celebrate him as the architect of this progress. The great man is also an exemplar of Victorian virtues. Albert was presented as the embodiment of Victorian values: diligence, piety, domesticity, intellectual curiosity, commitment to public service. So the memorial isn't just about Albert, but also about reinforcing these virtues. And finally, the great man is canonized after death. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning and her insistence on memorializing Albert contributed to his cult status. So this elaborate and symbolic nature of the Albert Memorial cemented his place as an almost superhuman, saintly figure whose influence continued to guide the nation even beyond the death. So in effect, the Albert Memorial was a projection of the collective hopes and achievements of the Victorian Age. Let's get a little bit into the reception history now, and I'll go back to Simon Heffer and finish out this chapter for you. Just one long paragraph to go. However, because of its style and what that style came to represent, the memorial was soon an object of disregard and even of obloquy. The cult of the great man passed out of fashion, as did high Victorian taste. When early in the 20th century, and for much of the next 3/4 of it, Victorian Gothic came to be regarded as overblown, tasteless, arrogant, and vulgar, Scott's memorial was deemed one of the most comical symbols of the genre. At the same time, his magnificent Midland Hotel at St. Pancras Station, now restored and considered one of the architectural wonders of Britain, was threatened with destruction. The latest edition of the Buildings of England compares Falk's Albert Hall favorably with the adjacent shrine, contrasting it with the verbosity of the Albert Memorial opposite. When considering the memorial itself, however, the editors do concede that it is a rich, solid, a little pompous, a little vulgar, but full of faith and self-confidence. Its recent restoration, with the colossal statue itself gilded once more, after the gilt was removed during the Great War for salvage, makes it again a breathtaking spectacle. The earnest ideas of the prince consort had fallen so far out of favor by the time of his wife's death that they made appreciation of his monument impossible for all but those who could make a leap of the imagination. The new regard in which this masterpiece of Scott is once more held has nothing to do with the cult of death, but suggests we are at last beginning to understand Albert's sincere and beneficent motivation to make Britain better. So you have quite a shifting reception history all over the map. So initially, from 1872 to the late 19th century, it was largely received with pride and admiration. Sir George Gilbert Scott, the designer, with his elaborate Gothic revival style, its intricate sculptures, his use of rich materials, they reflect the nation's grief and its high regard for the prince consort's contributions. And this was all looked up to. It was very lofty, symbols of national achievement, and a real testament to Queen Victoria's enduring love for her husband. And then this is followed by a period of disdain and neglect running from the early 20th century up through the 1980s. And this was, by the way, when I first encountered the memorial. I took a trip to England right after I graduated from college in 1986, and I saw the Albert Memorial. As Victorian taste fell out of fashion, the memorial's reputation began to decline. So in most of the 20th century, its ornate decorative style was seen as excessive, gaudy, baroque, even ugly by those who favored more minimalist or modernist architecture and aesthetics. And, the gilt was gone, literally, from the Albert statue, and the memorial was just viewed with indifference or derision, and it fell into disrepair, blackened by pollution and neglect. And then in the 1990s up through today, we have a reevaluation of the Albert Memorial. So this major restoration project began in the 1990s. It was reopened by Queen Elizabeth II in 1998. The restoration brought back its original gilded splendor, and the critics reevaluated it. Today, the Albert Memorial is appreciated as a masterpiece of Victorian Gothic architecture, a historical signpost of the cultural and political aspirations of the period. But coupled with this, of course, is a heightened awareness of the monument's imperialistic symbolism, the allegorical figures representing the continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. They depict civilized figures, but also they embody racial stereotypes that place Europeans in a higher position than the people of other continents. So that's problematic. And yet, having visited this monument myself on a second trip to England around 2013, I think it was, we spent a very nice afternoon around Kensington and Notting Hill and sort of that part of London. And I have to say that walking around the Albert Hall and the Albert Memorial and Hyde Park, it was pretty impressive. The architecture, the statuary, the gilded statue. We took tons of pictures of it, and I've shared a lot of those with you today. And it was a lot of fun for me to read much more about the memorial and Albertopolis, as it came to be known, where a lot of this stuff got built. I just drank this up. I've criticized Simon Heffer for going into excruciating detail in some of these chapters, and that criticism stands. But I also found it pretty fascinating to read more about where this was all coming from. So I'm going to finish this food for thought with just a question that I invite you to comment on. in response to this video. So do we look at this Victorian age, which is symbolized by things like the Albert Memorial, do we look at it with any kind of nostalgia today? Or is this something that we're continuing to reject and run away from? Are we somewhere in the middle? Just some food for thought, asking you to think about it. Maybe we can get some more conversation going. Maybe those of you who are from Britain, if I have any viewers over there, if you want to weigh in, I'm very interested in your thoughts about this memorial, how it's thought of today. So let's get some more conversation going. Hope you enjoyed this little tour. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.